Assalamualaikum listeners, welcome back to another episode of Boys in the Cave. I'm your host Tanzim, and alhamdulillah today I'm joined by a very special guest. She's best known for her project Muslim Condemns. Hera Hashmi is a law student based in the US with a background in cellular and development biology and linguistics. Her interests include the Islamic sciences, cognitive linguistics, and bioethics. She's also a founding member and contributor at Traversing Tradition, an online publication geared towards examining modern society through an Islamic lens. And so, assalamualaikum, Hera and Sister Hera, and welcome to Boys in the Cave.
Walaikum assalam. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for accepting our invitation to join on the podcast. Like I've been following your Twitter for a while, and especially with the sort of content that you cover and the sort of topics that you talk about, it's really an honor to have you and on the show and to really go into deeper topics and inshallah the listeners will benefit from. But I wanted to
Inshallah.
ask because I've seen you tweet about this not too long ago. I think you were like studying Egypt for a short bit, and you're also doing law at the moment as well. It's really interesting considering what I just mentioned about biology and linguistics, and your with the background in molecular, cellular, and development biology. So, what made you get into law at the moment?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, I did my background in biology, and then I worked in cancer clinical research for about a year and a half. And around that time, I was starting to get a little bit, I mean, alhamdulillah, we always need more doctors, and I feel like the most typical Desi kid saying this, but I did want to be a doctor when I was doing my undergrad. But after my Muslims Condemned project went viral, and I started learning more about this, area and issues, with Muslims and politics and things like that. I got more engaged in those spaces, and my husband, alhamdulillah, he encouraged me to pursue that. He noticed I was spending majority of my time outside of work, researching, writing, volunteering with, a civil rights organization. So he was like, why don't you pursue this, and actually get the degree? So I was like, yeah, I mean, alhamdulillah, I guess we have that blessing, and I was at a point where I could pursue that. But part of it was, if I'm going to do this, I want to be serious about it. And unfortunately, a lot of Muslims that are in this space of law and politics, I was a bit put off by, just kind of aligning with some progressive currents and movements that are not, in line with, a Muslim worldview. So I wanted to ensure that going into law school, I had at least, at the very minimum, a basic understanding of, just basic Islamic law. And of course, every Muslim has an obligation to fulfill their Fard al-Ain. So I left my job in May, and then we spent a few months in Egypt. And I had alhamdulillah, the blessed opportunity to study with my ustada Arabic and fiqh, and I hope to go back on a regular basis to study with her, inshallah.
Inshallah, yeah, it sounds very exciting. I guess undertaking the sort of project that you are, inshallah, benefiting the Muslim community. I guess afterwards, like because you have that kind of background in biology as well as this, like, are you going to potentially think about going back to biology, or it's just going to be, I guess, fixated more on focusing on law and assisting the community? As you said, I think Islamically speaking, and I was talking to a friend even just recently, like a few days ago, where even when it comes to career or working in corporate, you see like Muslim figures and stuff like that. I mean, those spaces, but essentially, a lot of them actually aren't practicing or are following, I guess Islamic practices, and it becomes even more difficult, right? And I assume in your context as well, where it's like there are Muslim, I don't know, Muslims in law within law, but then they're not abiding by, I guess, our standard of living in terms of religious practicing Muslims. So yeah, like essentially my question would be like, would you consider going back to Bajo, or is just going to be right now fixated on law, especially with your context and what you're looking to benefit the community in?
Yeah, of course. I mean, even when I was doing research and I was in biology, there are still issues that come up. Being, and inshallah, we can talk about this later. Being in STEM, there's a lot of, hidden assumptions about, science and what science, the role of science is in the world. But that you really do see that come to fore in law in a different way. I've only been in law school for a semester, so my observations would be limited. But as of now, I do intend to stay in law. There are some areas where I have considered maybe doing bioethical law or going into uh, you know uh, reproductive, that kind of debates that are happening there around women's rights and reproductive law. But I'm not 100% settled yet. I would say I have many interests, but the first year of law school, everybody has to take the same courses across the nation. So inshallah, second year is when I'll be able to explore different courses and see exactly what I want to narrow into, inshallah.
Inshallah, yeah, it sounds very exciting. And I don't know if I might, like, this question might put you on the spot a little, but you just
Hmm.
hinted at in law school, you see. So I might misquote you here, but something to the effect of, conflict between, I guess, seeing things Islamically and what you're observing in law school. Could you maybe give an example potentially of what that is? Like, it doesn't have to be something like, a big example, but just to give an idea, because I found that really interesting what you just hinted at.
Hmm. Yeah, I can give two examples. One more specific, one more abstract. So specific would be, with the Texas abortion bill. As a Muslim, we our perspective on abortion is not going to fully align with the pro-choice camp or even the pro-life camp. And even within the madhahib, there's differences of opinion. So it becomes a question of, okay, as a Muslim, I'm also Maliki, so we have a very particular understanding of when it's permissible and it's restrictive compared to the other madhahib. Uh, so as a Muslim, this is what I believe. How does that play out in terms of what policies I should be supporting, if any, right? So that can become a bit of a conflict, especially because I'm in the Bay Area. So I would say most of my cohort, they lean more pro-choice, and there's kind of a hidden assumption that everyone leans that way. So that alhamdulillah, though, we all are able to have open discussions about it. So that I would say on a granular level, there's always that question of what is my role as a Muslim? If I go into policy making, what's that going to look like? If I become a judge, what's that going to look like? On a more abstract level, in one of my criminal law classes, or not one of my criminal law, in my criminal law class, in the beginning, the professor had started off with theories of punishment. And it's interesting because when as Muslims, we think from a broader perspective, we have a concept of you violate someone's right, but also it's the head punishment is also divinely ordained, the hudud. So we also take into account actions that transgress Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Obviously, that's not part of the equation when it comes to the US justice system. So it can be a little bit, you feel a bit of cognitive dissonance because you're here in class and you're learning a particular theory of punishment, or you're learning about how different punishments are justified. And then you go back and you're like, this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says about crime, different types of sin. So it can feel a bit like you're trying to bounce back and forth between two worlds. So that's another area that I would bring up as an example.
Yeah, even in many fields of study where essentially we have that Western approach or that material approach, and we
Hmm.
know through our Islamic conception, there's a spiritual, there's a soul, there's this and that, which I guess maybe the Western world does not accept, especially in those fields of study. And in your specific context about law, obviously, Islamic through Islam we know there's an afterlife, and that takes into consideration in terms of how things are approached. Whereas the Western approach is more just whatever we see, what we observe, the here and now. It's more fixated on that. It strikes me. You'll see, like, I guess, multiple examples within the Sirah where Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam would specifically, he even detailed himself where it's like when two people make a case towards him about something that happened, it's like, I know that um, if a certain person can talk and be compelling in their speech in order to make a point, and he's like, if you do that, in terms of arguing for a case that you're lying about, just remember, I think to the effect of it was, remember your seat is in Jahannam. So it's always that
Hmm.
drawing to the afterlife and the consequences and those sort of ethics. Whereas I can only assume within the sort of Western context, that's not obviously coming into play, which is and then I can only assume, especially with law, like you have to sort of take that thinking out of the equation when you're seeing those classes. You have to like put it to the side and take on board how I don't know, wider society has conceived these issues, and especially the epistemology
Mhm.
framework. We just have to take theirs on board, and we're just sort of working with it, almost handicapped in a sense. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I do wish, and inshallah, I will get the chance to take more uh, philosophy slash jurisprudential classes. But for example, in my civil procedure class, we had a brief, very brief discussion about, one provision about, just the standard for juries, and it he brought up an issue of, okay, how do we interpret this the way that the founders of the Constitution understood this, or do we interpret this as how we understand it now, right? Which is basically like an usuli issue. And then he just went on. He said, "Oh, this is how we interpret it," and then he moved on. And I thought, like, no, I want to understand, you know, uh, in U.S. law, in our secular system, what theories are shaping the ways that we're understanding our laws, right?
Yeah, that conversation really, it becomes quickly complicated when you have to, take on board the Islamic foundations and try and tie it in
Hmm.
to how, I guess the philosophers or the thinkers that came up with those laws and the way we conceive it in our modern day and age. It could be, the democratic system or law, within certain laws or specific laws. And yeah, I can only imagine how difficult that would be. But I guess shifting the conversation a little, because I also wanted to dive into Islamic bioethics, and you said that you were in that field and you had some interesting experiences as well. Because I've listened to interviews that you've done in other podcasts and read your content online, especially your tweets that you put out. I think it's a really fascinating area as well in terms of it's sort of also like we were talking about law, like it ties in the sense that you have your Islamic foundations, you have your Islamic principles that is truth, and in saying that, it's like you have to work within a field where they don't see in the same way as you. So many, so you sort of have to navigate how to go about it, and new questions arise within that, and it's like we have to sort of dig into our tradition to uncover it, and how our Islamic principles, using our Islamic principles, how we would navigate this situation. These are very like all these new conversations, especially with technology and how fast it's progressing, right? So it's a really interesting conversation. But I guess the first question I wanted to ask, because you've done research in assisted reproductive technology, which is called ART, what would you be able to explain for the listeners what that exactly is?
Yeah, so I've done some research on, artificial insemination, IVF, surrogacy. Assisted reproductive technologies broadly refers to kind of technologies that intervene, aid, or hinder the reproductive process, generally in humans.
Yeah, exactly. And it was really interesting because even I recall in the Sirah, within our Islamic tradition, that if there was a case where someone claimed, like for example, as a husband or wife, well, actually, sorry, even before they got married, there's someone else that maybe the female or the male had relationships with, and then there's a guy that comes out, like there's a child born, and there's a husband or wife, and another guy comes along and says, that's actually my son. If I recall, the Islamic position on that is that you assume that the child is to the family that's yours born within it. So you don't like
Yeah, the,
raise doubts or try to question, this sort of status quo. But I guess right now, because like all this technology has, come to surface, and you can kind of, it's not that difficult now to, figure out, what was it, as to who the actual son and daughter is. Like,
mhm.
it's really interesting kind of conversation. I guess that example I was trying to use in the effect that technology kind of shapes now how we approach these discussions, because it's like someone can be like, but I can just get them tested and find out who the real
Mhm.
father is. And by Islamically, we know Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam had this specific case, and that's how he went about it. But yeah, so I guess that's with technologies. But I guess in terms of what you just mentioned with ART, like what is the Islamic position when it comes to using ART in order to address infertility?
Yeah, so um, before I forget, what you mentioned, the fiqh issue about who the child will be attributed to, it is attributed to the bed of the mother. So that actually becomes very pertinent when it comes to issues of surrogacy, but we can get there in a bit. ART, so generally artificial insemination, IVF, from my understanding, is that it, many opinions consider it permissible. I know a few scholars say IVF isn't, but I would say, there are many scholars out there who do consider it permissible with a few like conditions. One is that the sperm, well, let me explain IVF, right? IVF is the sperm coming from the husband and the egg coming from the wife. You fertilize it uh, in vitro, so like in a tube, like outside of the mother's womb, and then you insert the fertilized egg back into the womb. And this is usually done if there's some issues with, you know, um, any kind of abnormality. Maybe the woman's not able to get naturally pregnant. So yeah, there are many opinions that consider it permissible with the condition that the sperm is coming from the husband and the eggs coming from his wife, and the two are in an Islamically valid marriage. So there's no third party donor sperm, donor eggs are not allowed. With surrogacy, it becomes a little more complex because there's two different types of surrogacy. One is traditional surrogacy, which is a surrogate mother. She will be injected with the intending father's sperm. It's like a separate third party woman. Since we already know, like, you can't use third parties, that's already, impermissible off the bat. There has been more discussion on gestational surrogacy because genetically the material is coming from the intending mother and the intending father. It's just that the mother, for some reason, either she can't get pregnant or she doesn't want to be pregnant. That fertilized egg is implanted in the womb of another woman, right? So even though genetically the couple are the parents, Sheikh Amin Khulwadia has this really great article and actually a ruling, and he says that it's impermissible, and he uses this ayah in Surah Mujadila, your mother is the one who gives birth to you, to say that the child would be attributed to the surrogate, you know, to the surrogate mother, and that causes a confusion in lineage. So gestational surrogacy is impermissible.
Thank you for that clarification. Yeah,
Mhm.
that's really interesting with IVF, that it is permissible. I think it was really interesting because a long time ago I remember reading or watching this, sorry, listening to this radio talk show on the way to work. And what happened was, because I guess what you're trying to say is like through the Islamic tradition it's permissible, but what happened was there was a Christian couple that was having issues with having a child, and then I think they're practicing Christians, and what they had to face was that other people saying like, look, maybe it's a sign from God that you can't, you shouldn't be having a child, right? And that's it's a pretty hurtful thing to say, right? Especially to a family or a couple that's trying to have a child and they're struggling, and uh, for whatever circumstances. By saying that, it's like they're trying to religiously justify the fact that it's like we should stay away from these sort of things like IVF, etc. So I it's not, I guess, I don't know if that's the sort of sentiment you've encountered within the Muslim community, but I've seen it, I guess, in this evidence of the radio show. Like I've seen it in other religious communities where it's like they try to shun technology in that way, or try to even justify certain situations why it's happening, and say that it's a sign from God. Like I don't know, have you had that sort of experience within Muslim community in of itself?
Yeah, I have, and I really recommend Sheikh Amin Khulwadi. And for listeners who aren't familiar, he's the founder of Dar al Qasim, based out of Chicago, and they're doing really great bioethics research. And his ruling, or the you can read online if you just look up Sheikh Amin Khulwadi surrogacy. He he calls this approach a theological approach because he discusses the legal ruling, but then he says we have to take a step back and understand that the way that we're framing infertility is probably not the best way because and academics have done this, where if you frame infertility as a disease, then they'll justify surrogacy as like treatment or a darura, like it's a necessity, right? But we know that from the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he explicitly says that being barren or being not being able to have kids, that's completely in his domain. We have the story of Zakaria alayhi salam, we have the story of Ibrahim alayhi salam, and their wives who were unable to conceive, right? And then they asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and he granted them children. And so I see this as a broader problem of just we need to step back and frame infertility properly, right? And when we talk about these technologies, there is that, side of me that's like, we have to be sensitive, because oftentimes we view the inability to have children as a moral failure, especially on part of the woman. And as Muslims, we need to ensure that, when we're talking about the permissibility of these technologies, it's also about, you know, if we frame infertility as it's a disease, you have to fix it in any way possible, but then I come and say, oh, surrogacy is haram, right? That seems almost cruel in a way, right? So I think we have to go back to the beginning and be very careful from beginning of how we're framing infertility, and being clear about, um, there are other ways to achieve taqwa in this life, and gain closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala if you're unable to have children. And that doesn't take away from you at all. But we also shouldn't see infertility as you did something wrong and that's a punishment from Allah, right? Like, that is the trial that you have been given. So there's a lot of aspects to it, I would say, but that is something I hope that as we learn more about, biology, that we're able to come back to the very beginning, look at the Quran, and think about how is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala telling us to work through these trials, and understand infertility.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for sharing that. It's very very pertinent. The
Mhm.
points that you brought up, and I guess just to add, it just reminded me, especially I think in terms of moral failure. I think especially within the Muslim community, for the most part, I think women get the get very criticized, because it's like people view it as them, having the inability to, when it's really, it could be the man as well, but women get
Yeah.
the have to struggle more, because the sort of stereotype, or that how people perceive it, is that it's actually their fault, if anything. So I think that's one aspect that we have to also understand, that it can be a guy's fault, and yeah, like guys just equally could be equally as responsible anyway. So there's that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And children are a gift from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? So, if that is in your qadr, if you're not able to have kids, there is absolutely no, it's so hard to be like, well, saying that's a punishment is okay. We don't know. That could be a trial from Allah. That is the means through which, if they overcome this obstacle, they gain more piety and more taqwa than the rest of us, right? And one of the examples is, the mother of the believers, Aisha radiallahu anha. She bore no children of her own, yet she attained such a level that is impossible to describe, right? So that, inshallah, I would say that that's something we need to keep in mind, whether it's just general discussions about infertility, but also about, Muslims in bioethics who are looking into interventions, and potential ways to help Muslims who are struggling with infertility, to really keep that in mind.
Yeah, definitely. And even with Aisha radiallahu anhu, Rasulullah some sort of, passed away in a, while she was, I think, he was in a like lap, something to that effect as well. So you can see like the status of her in that regard. And yeah, as you mentioned, she didn't have any children, but that doesn't mean, that doesn't take away from her status, right? And a
Absolutely.
piety as well. I wanted to also ask, I guess, talked about reproduction, etc., IVF, but you also did work with species of African frog embryos. So what was your work there? What? And I also wanted to ask, like, after you've answered that, like, what are embryos for listeners that are new to understanding this?
Yeah, embryos is just an egg that's been fertilized and then like has been developing for a few weeks. So this was during my undergrad. We were doing this was in the context of doing a gene knockout experiment. We each had to pick a gene that we wanted to research and carry out a experiment that would allow us to perhaps narrow down the function of the gene. What do I mean by that? Um, I guess the best way to explain it is like a bicycle. If you have a bicycle and you're trying to figure out, let's say you don't know anything about a bicycle, you've never seen one, you've never like heard what it does. If you want to figure out what the wheel part does, you remove it and you see what happens to the bike, right? So when the bike is unable to move forward, then you make the conclusion that, oh, the wheel has something to do with the locomotion of the bike. So similar concept with the gene knockout experiment. We each had to choose a gene that we wanted to, there wasn't too much literature on, figure out what function it plays in the development of an embryo. And we use CRISPR-Cas9 technology, which is like a genetic scissors. It goes in and you know mutates, or like it causes a gene to be deactivated, and then see what impact that would have on the development of this embryo. And we did this experiment with Xenopus laevis embryos because they develop pretty quickly. We don't have time to go with mice or rats, which are normally used in animal experiments. At least at CU Boulder, like in some contexts. Um, so we carried that experiment out. I think I chose a gene that had to do with like the Golgi apparatus, or I don't even remember. Now that I'm in law, I've like forgotten a lot of my genetic genetics classes, but that was kind of the gist of it, is using genetic like gene editing technology to induce a mutation in a frog embryo.
Especially in the stage of embryos, like developing embryos past the nervous system. I guess I've heard you talk about this in Darwin project, if I remember.
Yeah.
um, because when that happens, that essentially the embryo will feel pain, right? In
Hmm.
that situation, and so it's an early stage, but then it feels pain, and then because from the secular institutional perspective, since it's feeling pain, that's where it's like, okay, we shouldn't, was it continue it any further because it's feeling pain, if that makes sense. What's your sort of situation there? Could you maybe elaborate a bit about that? Comes to pain and embryos um, encountering pain.
Yes, that's correct. So at our university, they have committees that I'm not familiar with like any federal law on this, but on the university level, they had committees that regulated the use of animals for research purposes, and they had certain conditions. So for undergraduates, if they were doing experimentation with animals, they weren't allowed to develop the embryos past a stage where their nervous system allowed them to feel pain. So for Xenopus laevis, the frog species, we couldn't develop them past stage 35. That's when their nervous system was kind of robust enough, or like that's when they kind of started developing the nervous system. And the reasoning was is that at that point they can feel pain, and this you know undergraduate level experiment we were doing did not justify it. It wouldn't justify letting the embryos develop past that phase. So on a graduate level they had different rules and things like that, but that's kind of where I got interested in Islam and bioethics, because when I heard that, my first response was, you know how do we understand ethics, and how do we make that decision of whether something is valuable enough that we can allow pain to be felt, and why do we even consider pain to be the measure, right? It's like a very utilitarian perspective. So that was my intro into Islam and bioethics, and just generally thinking about these things.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating topic of conversation, especially. What would your take be? Would you say that because the embryo is facing or encountering pain, that's when we should essentially stop? And I guess you mentioned it's because of undergraduate situation. It's like it doesn't justify, extra pain or going past this stage for the sort of task at hand. Maybe potentially, in a different scenario, different case, by expert researchers or whatnot, they'll have a justification to go past that stage. But from your own sort of perspective and your own research, what would you say the Islamic position, or your own, sort of perspective when it comes to just the fact that we should stop when it comes to, the embryos encountering pain, and yeah, that's it. Like, would you say that no, like potentially within Islam it says like we can go past that, or I don't know, like I don't know if that
Hmm.
exists, but yeah, what's
Yeah.
your take on that?
Yeah, this is an area I haven't been able to find too much research or literature in English. There are academics writing about this. I haven't, found too many ulama in English, since I'm kind of mostly limited to English, discussing this issue. I'm sure that, there's literature out there, but I'm not aware of it. But there would be multiple considerations to make because obviously our end goals, that are very different. For example, even like the kinds of experiments that we want to do, right? Would Muslims be on board with an experiment like, the surrogacy example? You know, from the get-go, that's not something we want to pursue further, right? Like, khalas, we're gonna go and try to find other interventions that are in the realm of the halal, right? So any kind of animal experimentation, we would have to keep in mind, like, for what ends, and are these ends that are virtuous from an Islamic perspective? Um, and in general, though, like Sheikh Musa Ferber has a few papers about animal rights and ethics. So obviously, we have a very robust and holistic, understanding of animals as a creation of Allah Subhanahu wa Taala. What rights they're owed. How do we limit pain and treat them as they should be treated, right? So those would be considerations to make in this issue.
Yeah, it's definitely sounds like an interesting topic and issue to really delve into and unpack a bit more. So yeah, in terms of, I guess, going into more DNA, um,
Mhm.
would you be able to explain what is DNA and why is there conversation around the ethics of tampering with DNA?
Yeah, DNA, I mean, I'm sure many of us have heard in high school, it's the blueprint of the cell, deoxyribonucleic acid. It has the DNA contains genes that code for different, everything from like enzymes to, whatever is needed for your cells to function. And this came up fairly recently, as an ethical, well, it's been an ethical issue for a long time, but it was brought up again because there was a researcher in China who carried out a CRISPR-Cas9 uh, gene edit. He like gene edited, or he edited the genes of like embryos, human embryos, and they were allowed to develop to full like they were allowed to develop into fetuses, and they were born. And there was a huge like backlash against that because as of now, gene editing in humans is like very limited. Like there's been like international agreements about this because it's so fickle and we don't know the long-term effects it can have on a person. Um, and it kind of brought up a lot of issues of, well, we're not going to be able to understand our genetic code properly if we can't tamper with it. But then others were like, well, we don't even want to go down the route of potentially inducing like lifelong issues in people, right? Like that's a big no-no. Um, so that's sort of the I would say context behind a lot of these debates you're seeing these days about CRISPR-Cas9 and gene editing.
That's really interesting because I assume now it's almost like they're just trying to figure out this level of experimentation to it, and so if they allowed to go past, for example, you mentioned I think the fetus and make it into human, but we don't actually know what's going to happen, or I guess there's a gamble element to it. And it's like, I
Hmm.
guess from the Islamic perspective, how do we, go about approaching that? Do we even, get involved and try to unpack it further, or do we like stay away and be like, we don't want to tamper with, the creation of Allah or something to that effect? So, what would you say the perspective of that Islamically would be from your sort of observation?
Yeah, that's also a big question, and inshallah, I would love to see Muslim Islamic institutions and Muslims be very forthcoming with this discussion. Um, Gene editing, even before you get to religious issues, it has a major problem, which is how do we measure progress, right? So people will say gene editing is useful. We need to develop it because it has the potential to eradicate diseases that cripple people for life, right? So one disease that I researched when I was in my undergrad was adenosine deaminase deficiency, and it's like one gene that's messed up, and it causes like a slew of problems with your immune system, and your quality of life is just it's so it's completely hindered because of it. And if you look at this technology and you say, oh well, that has the potential to fix it, why not? And then, of course, the big concern is the slippery slope argument and the argument of like, okay, well, there are some diseases that we can clearly say, okay, we don't, it'd be great to get rid of them. But then there's an issue of like, well, what if we go beyond therapy and into enhancement, right? So start using gene editing technologies to make people taller, make people smarter, make people, have blue eyes and blonde hair. Like there's a lot of uh, concerns with access, with racism, with eugenics that we can't ignore. Um, and and just like the framing of how do we like what are we using to measure progress as humans? Um, so those are some issues we'd have to keep in mind if we were to continue doing research into gene editing technologies.
That's a very fascinating question, and I guess I don't know. I'm just speaking off the cuff, but in terms of how do we measure progress, Islamically, perhaps I don't know what springs to mind is like taqwa, the sense of God consciousness, and how essentially like how we view like the Sahaba's time. It's like right now as time goes. I remember having this conversation with someone like as time progresses, it's almost like we're getting further away from the time of Sahaba, and there's going to be more fitna, more trials, tribulations, etc. Right? But when you talk to like someone who's not a Muslim and very engaged, very engaged and promotes the sort of Western perspective and the Western lifestyle, it's like no, technology is increasing, things are getting better, etc. Which I understand that perspective, right, in terms of maybe from a health physiological perspective, but it's like from the actual sense of the word of what we mean progress, it's like no, it's getting further away, right? So if the gene editing technique could help people build taqwa, I'd be like, yeah, no, like that's good. But it's obviously not like that. But what would you say, like, well, how would you say like Islam would measure progress in that specific context of genes and DNA and stuff?
Oof, subhanAllah. I don't know if I can answer that, to be honest, and I really wish I had done some reading on gene editing issues. Again, like a lot of the research is happening in Malaysia, in Qatar with Kyle Center. Like, unfortunately, English, we really don't get, those rich, uh, you know, uh, new research coming out. Like when we were in Egypt, we went to the Cairo Book Fair, and there was like a book that had been published with from Azhar, which was like on Corona and Islam. And I was like, SubhanAllah, it was all in Arabic, so I couldn't pick it up to read it. But I would have to say sorry, I can't answer that just because it has so many considerations to make. And you mentioned like, okay, if gene editing could increase taqwa, well, to what degree should we preserve? Well, let me give an example. If gene editing could remove a person's ability to lie, would we want that? Or do we want to preserve free will and a virtue in people wanting to tell the truth, not being genetically encoded to tell the truth? And the other issue with this, hypothetical is that a lot of these, this excitement about what gene editing can do also predicates on an idea of the human, like it has a very like biological determinist understanding of DNA of our genetics. So, not to have cop out, but I pose that as a hypothetical to listeners. To what degree do we want virtue to be encoded in our genetics, or do we want to preserve, um, the opportunity to become virtue of our own will?
Yeah, like that's a very very heavy question. It's like
Yeah,
um,
yeah.
it's like
It gets into
philosophical.
transhumanism and issues with that. So
Yeah, and it goes into the kind of philosophical discussions, and you'd have to, I guess, unpack Islamic principles and foundation. It's actually really fascinating. I would probably even have to think long and hard for many
yeah.
years about that. But
Hmm.
essentially, like from my own experience, I tell friends like even though I did a commerce degree in my electives, I did different subjects from different faculties, and one of them I did psychology subjects, and you can already see like the assumptions of or sort of posing the question that the soul doesn't exist and making cases and reasons for that, right? And it's like from a Muslim perspective, we know soul does exist. Like, why is this even a question? We have our own Islamic principles to abide by from the Quran and Sunnah. But it's already up for grabs within, I guess, academia, where it's like they're even challenging questions where it's like you're questioning the foundations, and if you question the foundations, it's like I don't know what you have left to sort of work with. I need to
Hmm.
like sort of pick up the pieces, and essentially with what you were discussing in terms of free will, or even deterministic outlook within life, it's almost like embedded into the conversation when it comes within academia, within those
Hmm.
fields of study where non-Muslims are engaging with, and you have to grapple with that. Would you say like you yourself, when you were engaging with your studies, those were assumptions, and then you had to unpack that and really grapple with that, and it became more of a tedious task, right? Because we as Muslims have left to pick up the pieces and work with their assumptions and unpack their assumptions and kind of bring our foundations to the fore.
Yeah, I've said this before, I think on, a podcast or maybe I've tweeted it, but I do wish that, you know, science tracks had, or actually required a class on philosophy of science or ethics or something like that. Because, in the college environment, there's, even if people don't outright say it, low key, there's a huge, people have a misunderstanding of what science can and cannot do, right? Science can't answer moral questions. It doesn't tell you what's right and wrong. It actually, again, going back to the abortion issue, in one of my labs, one of my mentors, there was some abortion law or bill being proposed, and she was like, "Man, why aren't people like, why don't people believe in science? Like, science will tell you when life starts, right?" And she was saying this in a context of being like, pro choice, and for me, I was like, well, there's two problems here. One, science has science defined life. Does life start at when the brain develops or the heart develops? Like that's not even something that people have a consensus on yet. um Muslims, we do believe like when the ruh and everything, but they don't have a consensus. And number two, there's it shows or it exemplifies the limits of scientific naturalism, right? Because even if you could, let's say, determine when life starts, you can't, how does that have anything to do with the moral value judgment of when abortion is okay and not okay, right? So I think, being in that lab space, I realized people have a perception of science that's very much, science can give us the answers to life's questions, when that's not the case. Science can't give you the answers. It doesn't answer moral questions at all.
Yeah, definitely, and that's why essentially there's a level of needing to engage with many fields of study that needs to be essentially almost like multiple fields combined together in order to come to the right conclusions, and unpacking those discussions. To just assume that okay, I'm just going to go into science and somehow science will answer everything. That's like
Hmm.
very reductionist take, right? It's only a
Yeah.
slither of what the universe is, right? It's only just a small part. So we have to engage with different lenses, different fields in order to bring them all together, and that's essentially what Islamic scholars of the past did, right? They were like polymaths, and that's what they engaged with. But for some reason, for some, I think there's a lot of it's pop culture or wider society is that assumption that scientists equals enlightened people or something, right? And it's like whatever they say is gospel, and but in saying that, it's like they have their own beliefs. Even though they call themselves atheists, or we don't believe in anything,
Hmm.
but that's a belief in of itself. But they bring those assumptions to their works and try to prove their own preconceived notions, and so um, yeah, it becomes the point is more to say that we have to combine different fields and studies and really engage with it and bring it together to come to conclusions. So inshallah, yeah, like I guess with the Muslim community, when it comes to engaging with these subjects, we look to our scholars, unpack the Islamic principles that may touch on similar subjects that of what we have to encounter with today, bring that to the fore, and really unpack these conversations. Like even I had a thought like that remind me Mohammed Gilan, I think he talked about Alhambra Palace, where I haven't been there, but I think if I recall, he was saying that there's like a fountain, but it's um, it's constructed in a way where it's using gravity to make the water flow up. something like that. I'm not sure.
Mm.
And so the point was is like in this day and age, it's like we have motors and we have water pumps, and if they wanted to do a version of that, they would probably just you know put those more water pumps in and make the water flow up, right? It's like I don't know. I feel that with technology, there's that idea that they're gonna achieve X task or like whatever goal they have at any cost whatsoever, right? And we know water pumps, it consumes electricity, and it can be damaging to environment and all that sort of side effects, right? But it's
Mm.
like it's the easiest way to achieve the same task compared to I don't know the water fountain moving upwards using gravity without like anything pumping it in that sense. So it's really fascinating. It's like okay, but then how do we conceive? I guess what's our sort of approach when it comes to doing these innovations and tasks? Like, are we actually the way are we doing it? I don't know. It seemed to be the quickest way to do is the best way, and whatever is efficient. But it's from the efficiency perspective, is from the Western perspective. Whereas for us, it's like we almost have to be one with nature. You know what I mean? Like I guess from the Islamic tradition, how
Mhm.
we've gone about it or how we've done things, it's like that essence of connecting with nature, ourselves, God. It's always in the picture, but within I guess nowadays it's almost devoid of that, and it's all about achieving X material situation or task at any cost whatsoever, and whatever is the quickest way to do it, irrespective of the costs of it to environment and um, you know, lacking that taqwa, etc. Sorry, I kind of went to a spiel there, but I don't know if you had anything to add to that. But yeah, that was something just
No,
reminded me
alhamdulillah,
about.
I think you said it all, so inshallah.
In terms of, I also wanted to ask. We did touch on it, but I think not specifically about consent and justice. But why would concepts such as consent, justice be even discussed within bioethics? And what is the secular perspective on this issue and the Islamic perspective as well?
Yeah, so Western secular bioethics, I actually recommend a book by Dr. Sharmeen Islam. She does a comparative study actually on assisted reproductive technologies in a Western secular bioethics perspective versus an Islamic perspective. And she spends a couple chapters actually outlining, the, you know, principles of like bioethical principles in general. So it's like in the field there's a general understanding of these are the four principles that we care about in bioethics, and I can't exactly remember from off the top of my mind, but one of them is consent. And this was another issue actually with the gene editing situation that happened with the researcher in China, was that I don't believe that the mother was informed, or if she was, she wasn't informed to the extent that she should have been. So that's a big, principle of bioethics. You go to the hospital whenever you want to take on a big surgery that has, a lot of risks. You have to consent to it, right? There's some, legal issues there as well, like trying to avoid liability and, medical malpractice suits and things like that. But the point is that these principles in bioethics, it tries to universalize a general understanding of bioethics that everyone can agree to. Justice, I think one of them is like beneficence, like obviously, you promise to do good or limit the harm, right? So there's like general ideas that most people would be able to jump on board with. And Dr. Islam in her book mentions that it's not that it's that this perspective is at odds with Islam, right? Like Muslims, in Islam does have injunctions, like many of them, to do good, to limit the harm, right? People generally, they should be asked before they're given a treatment. The issue becomes like, there are some overlaps there, but there's also some ways that we will differ. So one example is recently, with euthanasia and pulling the plug. Do you weigh, doing no harm over, okay, this person's in pain, so we can, kind of a mercy pull the plug, right? I would say most Muslims don't, are very allergic to that idea at all. Like we don't like this idea of mercy killings, like killing someone to eliminate the pain, yes, but at the end we killed them. Um, so there's, or for example, in surrogacy, right? Most people, I don't want to say most, because there is still a debate even in feminist literature, but that's actually a good example. One camp prioritizes autonomy and, like, the potential for financial empowerment and women's empowerment. The other camp sees, the issues with surrogacy leading to exploitation, and those kinds of issues. So, you know, people would say, "Oh, you guys don't allow surrogacy," but it's a woman's choice. But we would say, no, yes, women have choices, but at the end of the day, it's haram, right? So that's where you can kind of get differences in the way that we understand these concepts.
Yeah, that's really fascinating, especially with the idea that almost like we have to play into the framework or the ballpark when it comes to for example, you mentioned their conception of what justice is, or their
Yeah.
conception of consent, and we have to sort of work to those limitations when essentially potentially the Islamic tradition is a lot more broader when it comes to the idea of consent, or not broader, but
Hmm.
different, or even
Yeah.
the whole conception of justice is definitely a lot more different. Especially, like I think I mentioned earlier, like a lot of injustices that may occur in this dunya, you'll get Allah will do justice in the hereafter. Like those kind of ideas, it's not even present, obviously, within the secular institutions. And so it's like, how do we kind of engage with that, and how do we grapple with that and these ideas, especially in this kind of specific context as well. So that's a really interesting kind of topic to really dissect and go into as well. I sort of remembered I'm jumping to another topic, like you talk about gene editing,
Oh,
because I
no
forgot
problem.
to ask you, but especially, like I think you alluded to, if you can change it to a point where maybe you can get someone who's blonde haired, or I don't know, smarter and all that. It's like, I'm not sure. Like I would like to hear your thoughts, but is that kind of conversation where it's like, oh, now humans are just playing God, playing, are just going about doing things at whim, how they want to do it, and it's like they have all the power and the control, and that's almost seen as very problematic, or very, it's down the wrong path in terms of I don't know, potential abuse that may occur within that. I don't know if those kind of discussions are had
Hmm.
within, yeah, within that field, but I'd like to hear your thoughts as well in that sense.
Yeah, that's certainly one of the bigger critiques, alongside slippery slope, like, to, eh, you are playing with God. Are these things we should be messing with, right? Like, for millennia, humans are born, they live and they die, and now we want to come in and start interfering with the very basis of, like, not, there's epigenetics and stuff like that, but I'm oversimplifying. But, like, messing with the genetic code that will have lasting effects. um, and this actually intertwines closely. I don't know how familiar you are with the transhumanism movement. Um, you know, Transhumanism has this idea of, like, science is going to launch humanity beyond its boundaries, right? Like, we're bound by the limit of human, our brains, our physical capacity stuff, and science will allow us to transcend those boundaries. I think, one of the aims popularly known about the transhumanism movement is, like, we'll finally be able to live forever, or we'll be able to establish a heaven on earth, right? Like a technological haven. Um, so transhumanism is predicated on this idea of, like, we are our own, we create our destiny, kind of thing. We have to harness this uh, science and technological power, and, like, go beyond our limits that no human has ever gone before, right? Like, super strong, super smart, whatever. Um, and it's a problem. Again, it's an issue of progress and what aims are we going towards. As Muslims, we know every human, you cannot escape death. Every human will die, that is promised, and every human will face their Lord, that is promised. Um, so what use is, I mean, not, I don't want to say what use. Obviously, we do have injunctions about, trying our best to improve people's lives in this world, and to establish justice. But at the end of the day, what matters is our efforts. We're not promised an end result, and true justice can only be achieved in the akhirah. So we have a very different, like, we're not trying, I would say, I hope we're not out here trying to establish a Jannah on earth. Like, we don't, and we certainly don't put our hopes in in technology and in science.
Yeah, it was interesting you mentioned about the transhuman movement. It reminds me, I
Yeah,
don't know if it's part of the transhuman movement, but I was reading where people think that because I don't know, our body has is very limited in its functions and capabilities, and if like having a consciousness, people were saying like, oh, downloading our consciousness onto I don't know the virtual reality or
mind upload, right, Kurzweil, kind of thing. Yeah,
things like that, and it's like, oh, that's when we'll be I don't know, perfect beings and live forever and do what we can do. And especially like I guess virtual reality, it's like we can kind of be in charge of our own destiny and how we want to do things. It's really like, I don't know, it's really interesting. And I remember I won't mention the name, but I was having that kind of conversation where it's like, is there a potentiality? And I like the kind of thought process, like in terms of potentially um, seeing where the example or scenario may take, where maybe potentially we get to a point where we live in that kind of crazy, I don't know, reality or world where insane technological advancements and everything's very digital, and I don't know, the maybe we will. It's almost like virtual reality and reality is like one and the same, maybe. And it's like how do we go about it? And I don't know. I was just someone one like a very esteemed student of knowledge, just kind of entertaining that thought. And it was just like maybe I don't know if it comes to the end of times, hadith, etc. Maybe it could be in a digital world in the way like I think we perceive it in reality, but it's like maybe those kind of I don't know, events or situations or wars and battles or whatever happen in more in a virtual reality than we think. But I don't know, I'm just it was just entertaining that
sounds
thought.
like the Matrix.
Yeah, something like that, right? You never know.
Yeah,
Like especially with I guess how the world is turning out, we can never be like fully sure, but something interesting to kind of consider. But yeah, obviously in terms of, it's not like I'm saying that we're going to live forever, right? Obviously not. Quran is very clear,
yeah,
everyone's going to die, and it's almost like as you mentioned with justice, it's like we're not going to be able to establish a Jannah on earth. It's like people are trying so hard to create that, like which is
because they
fine.
don't believe in God.
Exactly, yeah. And it's not like I don't I guess I'm not demeaning in the sense that like look, it's good to be, exercise justice and be good in this world and do it to the best of your abilities. But we know ultimately because we'll end up dying, it will come in the afterlife. But that thinking for I guess the non-Muslim who are very steeped into I guess the Western outlook may not even perceive that at all. Like it's not even in the equation of sorts. So it's almost like to them, I don't know, the question of free will or even exercising desires, it becomes like I want to, exercise as much desires as we want, and and from the Islamic perspective, we know through the spiritual tradition, it's almost like taming the nafs, and that means almost like absent, right? But it's not to say like there's a big culture within, I don't know, more potentially like entrepreneur business mindset type people like discipline and hard work, etc. Maybe that's a different side, but yeah, there is that other side where it's like I guess what the Islamic tradition brings when it comes to the nafs and all that kind of conversation, it's not even in the picture at all within those kind of technological conversations as well.
Mhm. For
But yeah,
sure.
also I wanted to, I think going into, since we were talking about science and technology, um, I also wanted to, as I'm sure we covered a lot in terms of gene editing, DNA,
Mhm.
embryos, etc. And inshallah, I think it's a really fascinating conversation. But I also wanted to, it was all part of science, but I guess I wanted to also talk about science specifically, maybe in a more general perspective. But when it comes to scientific inquiry ideologically neutral, and such a does such a term exist?
Yeah, this is a question for philosophy of science, and not to plug, my the publication I co-founded, but Traversing Tradition has a really good article by a brother who introduces philosophy of science. Um, Science, it's a social enterprise, and it's carried out by people, and people are ideologically driven, right? There are very few known facts in science and many unknowns, and the way that these unknowns are pursued by people, uh, they're pursued with ideological commitments and ideological undercurrents, and people will say no, well, that's true, right? Like the types of questions that people ask are, and the kinds of things that they're concerned about are ideological, but can't you say that, the process of the science is neutral, and I would still say no because let's see how I can best explain. The way that it was explained to me is that the scientific method, from observation to experimenting to making conclusions, these observations aren't made in a vacuum. They're not made in isolation. They're made within an idea of the world. So even in biology, when we undertake certain experiments, the whole issue, for example, um, a lot of gene editing discourse it has a assumption that of like biological reductionism, right? Or a lot of with neuroscience and mental health research, there's different models of mental health: the psychosocial model, the biochemical model, right? It hinges on a certain understanding of the human being. Um, and science also, like, especially when people seek to position science as like a neutral arbiter or a source of knowledge, I always have to ask, well, as Muslims, we have other valid sources of knowledge, revelation, right? You open a basic aqidah book, like actually just yesterday my husband was explaining to me, for example, Sanusi's creed, right? There's a distinction between hukum adli and hukum adi, right? Hukum aqli is like 2 plus 2 is 4. Like that's something that it's a fact. It's something you can reason out. And then hukum adi is something that you you experience over time. And okay, when there's a fire, there's burns, right? You'll be burned. But the scientists would say, well, the fire is causing the burn. What we would say is, okay, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala creates a fire, there's burns. He creates burns. And this is a better, like, if someone had told me this when I was in, like, my undergrad, I would have been better able to understand what exactly science is doing, and better be able to understand our own tradition, right? In the Quran, for example, the story of Ibrahim alayhi salam in the fire, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told the fire, become cold, and give, send salams and peace upon Ibrahim alayhi salam, right? So miracles are easier to understand when we understand, like, from our perspective, when we say A causes B, that's not what we mean. What we mean is when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, creates A, there B is also there. But because he created this, he can, I hope I'm being careful with this because this is an aqidah point. What we're saying is, like, when there's A, there's B, not that A always has to cause B, right? So I really hope that made sense, inshallah, but please correct me if there's any issues there with the way I explained it. But essentially, what I'm trying to say is that when we look at science, we're looking at aqidah coming down to the level of our human experience. And I really wish that during my undergrad I had sought out being able to understand basic aqidah, because I didn't realize how much it would actually inform the way that I was understanding what I was doing when it came to experiments, when it came to formulating a hypothesis and trying to understand how this is being related to this, or how this gene is causing this issue, right?
Yeah, that's a really good point about the Aqidah point that essentially we're making. I think the issue is like in that from that sort of perspective, essentially, I guess in the world around us, like for example, fire burns, and if we touch it, it hurts, whatever, or there's a burn mark that happens as a result. I guess potentially like one of the wisdoms when it comes to that is that we can experience a level of consistency as a human being, in the sense that things for us will be on a level of sanity, right? Like there's a level of consistency, things happen, but that doesn't mean, I guess, what you were talking about is that always it's almost like intrinsically, because there's a fire, it's like intrinsically that's the result of why you have a burn mark if you touch it or whatever. Like, it can be any other way, like Allah, causes both in situations, right? The burn mark isn't because intrinsically because it's a fire, because Allah, made that burn mark
Mhm.
on your hand when you touch it, etc. But yeah, like in terms of that consistency, yeah, like we see a level of consistency, and that's more because of our benefit, so we can, there's a level of predictability, right, and we can function like a normal human being. And yeah, so I think even that understanding, like that's a very like Islamic perspective, from a foundational perspective within our tradition and theology, where you go into the science world and it's not there to the effect that would like to think. Like, I guess the closest thing would be in philosophy when they discuss like David Hume and I think the
Hmm.
pull shot.
Yeah.
He makes that similar point. But in terms of science in of itself, it's I assume it's mostly absent. But yeah, would you say that's the case, like from your experience as well, like that kind of understanding that we just articulate from the Islamic tradition? It's more like it's almost assumed, like material, like whatever you see or whatever you see is like every physical cause is like a physical reason, and that's the only way. It's almost like physical processes, like philosophical naturalism basically. And that's like the predominant underpinning when it comes to approaching science, right? So
Yeah, especially because, and this wasn't the case historically, but today there's this, perception that if you're a scientist and if you're a good one, you don't really bring God into things. If you even believe in God, many scientists are. I don't know what the statistics are, but you know, I only had one. I only knew one person in our lab, and she was a Christian. And she was that was really the only connection I had with someone who did try to bring God into her work. Everyone else, there's just this assumption that we're working within the natural world and only natural phenomena can explain other natural phenomena. Like that was the assumption. Everything operated on this idea that if something happens, there has to be an observable, visible, tangible explanation for it. Um, and as soon as you go try to explain it through means outside of that, it's bunk. It's pseudoscience. Um, and this comes like I'm not as familiar with neuroscience, but you really do see this issue in like discussions about mental health, and especially in the Muslim community, there's so many debates about like spirituality and mental health, and then also like the biological aspect of it, the biochemical aspect of it. Um, and alhamdulillah, like I would recommend it for those interested to look into Dr. Rania Awad's work, and Malik Badri and Abdullah Rothman. But you can kind of look into that field and see, and just kind of assume that that's how it is in other fields. It may not be as noticeable, but it's there where you things can only be explained in a way that uh, has nothing to do with God at all. Like there's no, it has to be tangible, otherwise it doesn't exist. When that, science only explains this very limited, perception of a limited realm of our perception, right? What does that have to do with like if does that mean that if you can't prove it through science it doesn't exist? Of course not. But people go that far. They're all scientists, is what I'm trying to say,
yeah, yeah, like I actually have a
or
quite
ascribe to scientism. Yeah.
I've quite like you really brought up really good points, and it just reminded me. Like I have a friend we were talking the other day, and they when it comes to physical situations and processes, and it's almost like that's the only way they'll view it. It's like this physical issue is there. It's only a result of physical
Hmm.
processes, and he was talking about his own situation where he had a really bad stomach issue for a while, and he went to like the best specialists, the best doctors, etc. They couldn't fix the problem. And later on, I'm not sure actually as to how he found out. Maybe it was actually like a good doctor or a holistic approach. I'm not sure, but he told me like later on he ended up finding out that the reason is because of trauma he experienced. Like I guess
Hmm.
the perspective is more to highlight the fact that because initially it was treated as a stomach issue. They tried to find very physical, reasons and processes, but really it was like more of spiritual of sorts. And I think in Abu Zayd al-Balkhi Sustenance of the Soul, he highlights how it can get to a point where obviously there is that element that physical situations can be a result of physical processes, but there's also the we also know that spiritual issues can give rise to physical issues as well. And so I'm not to say like doctors don't don't factor that in at all. But it's almost, but the point is, I'm just trying to highlight is that he had to work really hard. He went to the best specialist, and it's almost like they didn't diagnose that kind of more holistic issue. Rather, it was very like specific, very particular based approach. And like there's this issue we need to get we need to eradicate it. It's like how can we eradicate it? And it's almost from I guess the physical perspective, as in treating it in that sense, but it wasn't actually addressing the issue, which is really I found that really interesting. And just to add as well, I remember when I had a conversation with Mohammed Gilan when it comes to neuroscience, because even with my experience in psychology, where I mentioned that the conversation of does a soul even exist is up for debate, because it's almost like if an accident, because I remember doing like a case study, it's like a person gets into an accident, they have brain damage, that personality changes. So it's like the brain is I don't know, personality is like everything that's in the brain is where the personality resides or something to that effect. I think that was just, it was a while back I did the class, but it was something along those lines. And um, so that was the only sort of case study I was exposed to where it's almost like I want to say it was like an iman shake or whatever, but it was almost like how do I grapple with this from an Islamic perspective, right? Because there's a lot to sort of take in of sorts. Like, do you become accountable for I guess mistakes and situations that you go about if your whole personality changes and your behaviors change right after that incident? Or I don't know. Like, I think grappling with it was a really interesting case. But aside from that, I remember Mohammed Gilan made a point where it's like I think there's also other case studies where people had like I think if I recall like half their brain missing or a large portion of their brain missing, and they were perfectly fine. They didn't even know that they were having any issues. You know what I mean? And it was almost like I think a regular checkup, like a little headache. They found out like there's something like important from your brain missing or something to that effect, and you know. So I found that really interesting because I didn't know about that, and he mentioned I might be butchering the example, but I remember something along those lines. And so it's almost like that kind of question. I guess my sort of point is more that holistic approach, that understanding that I guess philosophical naturalism or just looking at physical processes as if it's almost the only way to view truth is like incorrect. I guess from the Islamic perspective, we know there's a spiritual dimension, spiritual world, etc. There's a bigger world out there that we can't conceive. So to just limit it to physical processes is a very very reductionist take, if anything.
Yeah, and one disclaimer I do want to note is all of this doesn't mean that we are discounting all of the discoveries of science. Our job isn't to stop it, but to correct its mistakes and like integrate it into our worldview. But I think the Muslim community has a habit from swinging from one extreme to another, where we have this very deterministic, very like materialistic perspective to like, oh, we don't go to a doctor at all, don't care about that, just sit and read Quran, and I think all of both sides are very reductionist. Of course, like our first weapon when it comes to anything is making dua to Allah, right? At the same time, we do we do seek out care, with the understanding that ultimately healing comes from Allah, right? So you know just to since we've been critiquing these limitations, I do want anyone who's wanting to go into this area is to really bring in, as a Muslim, like if you're going to be a Muslim doctor, if you're going to be a Muslim therapist, whatever it is, come from a perspective in which your theology and your Muslim Islamic worldview encompasses your profession.
Yeah, definitely. And essentially, you brought up really important points in regards to um, especially like using these tools. It's like almost like science is a tool in the toolbox. It's not the only tool in the toolbox, if that makes sense. I guess Islamically, we should be utilizing different fields and coming to truth, not just putting our hopes and dreams on science as if it's going to answer everything, as you unpacked. There's assumptions to it. There's all these kind of limitations to it where it doesn't I guess align with our Islamic principles. So there's that sort of things that to factor in into those conversations. And so I would want to ask, I think it's sort of connected. I guess you touched on it, but I guess specifically to ask you is like, as Muslims, how should we use science? Like, what should our purpose be for using science?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, I did mention a bit of like the creedal aspects before, and you also mentioned like it's not unique to Islam, like even Hume has pointed out, just because things have happened in the past doesn't mean it's going to continue to happen, like all of those problems and limitations. Um, but it's not, it's still important, right? Because it does give us new information about the world around us. We just have to understand that, these aren't universal truths, that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can change them. He can, He is the creator. He can, change what we're observing. But we do have to, you know, we have to look at it and ultimately, ask ourselves, what are, why are we seeking this knowledge, right? When we want to discover, new planets, or look into research to cure different types of cancer, right? Why are we pursuing these questions? And at the end of the day, I mean, the answer is, we want to live good lives, and we want to live, pious lives. So for the Muslim who's, growing up in this environment and wants to, become a scientist, but wants to be like, someone who approaches it from a very Islamic perspective, I would say, learn your aqidah, especially like, I don't know in Australia, but at least here at the universities, like atheism is a big problem, secularism is a big problem. Like you're surrounded by so much doubt, and my sister, for example, she's studying engineering physics, and she gets into like quantum physics and a lot of this like abstract stuff, and it can be hard for her to pull out of that, because she was like, I didn't realize how much of everything else was being affected. My understanding of the deen was being affected just by being in these classes, right? So uh, seek out teachers, learn basic aqidah, and then understand that science isn't bad. But it has limitations, and be okay with those limitations, and be very specific in what aims, to what goals you're trying to further.
Yeah, like even like it's more of a means, but it's not like using it as means for, I guess, Islamic project, in terms of, as you mentioned, piety as well. And in saying that, it's almost, I think, the why important, the why you're doing this. It's a very very, like, it sounds like very simple question, but there's a lot of profundity to it. It comes to, especially as Muslims, we're meant to reflect consistently and regularly on the whys and the intentions into doing certain actions, and why you acting this way, and having that sense of reflection and thought and contemplation as a recurring theme in the Quran. And essentially, when it comes to getting tied up, I guess, with our modern day culture, capitalist society, we're almost like, I don't know, the why. Maybe we don't reflect on the why and the intentions as much. Seeking wealth, it's like, why are we doing it? It's just like everyone around us is doing. We're sort of drawn to it, but taking, pausing and asking ourselves why we're doing this. So in regards to science as well, in that specific context, the why and the intention behind it is it's a tough one to ask, especially if from a, if you're not like, if someone's not a Muslim, it becomes maybe a difficult, like, it might be simple in the sense of, oh no, like we just want to do things quickly and efficiently, but it's like, why? You ask the why on the whys, and I don't know, there's a sense of emptiness when you peel the layers a bit. From my own perspective, like there's that level of I don't know, there's not much there in that sense, right? Maybe potentially it's more about fulfilling the desires and getting things quick and fast, right? And if it's like, if the reason and the purpose for having these technological advancements and scientific advancements is based on just wants and desires ultimately as the core reason, obviously that's problematic from an Islamic perspective, right? And so for us as Muslims, it's more about the intentions, the why. We know that whatever occurs and whatever happens from a very physical perspective does not mean that it's more about we get rewarded for our intentions, not necessarily like actions, right? The famous
Mhm.
hadith. So yeah, excuse me, yeah. So like, I think there's that aspect, and I thought that was a really good point that you touched on, which, I don't know, it seems lacking in terms of reflections and the use of science and why we do it. And I guess for us Muslims, it's almost like we just use it as a means for our Islamic project, that which is like getting closer to Allah and helping society around us, etc. So, but I also wanted to go into like secularization within academia for a little bit before I ask you some few questions on language and linguistics, which is really another fascinating
Yeah.
subject area, which I'd love to get your thoughts on. But in terms of secularization within academia, we know that in Islam, Islam is our way of life and dictates our actions and how we should see and view things. Naturally, within university and academia, it is secular in nature, so sometimes you are perhaps unable to bring forth the Islamic understanding to the table. Um, have you had any such instances or situations you had to navigate, this dilemma? And if so, what has been your experience in that?
Yeah, with secularization, it was interesting because during my undergrad, I would say the biggest issue was like scientism and working with that ism. And now in law school, you really do see like because I'm studying a secular legal system, right? Which has some roots in like British common law, which was had like some religious roots there, but it's for the most part it's a secular legal system, and especially with my criminal law class, I gave the example earlier of like theories of punishment. One of the first chapters in the textbook that we had was the idea of punishment is relative, and the idea of what's just and reasonable is relative. Not all, like everything that's moral isn't encoded in law, but law does reflect the morality of a people. Which, and then it just moved on to a bunch of like criminal law cases, and it shows like the limitations of you know we're sitting here learning the law, but we're not questioning like where are these laws coming from and on what basis are these laws being made in terms of how we understand punishment, how we understand really anything, like even contract law and the idea of possession. Like my husband's studying Mukhtasar Khalil, and like scholars have discussed this, like what makes a contract, what does it make a contract, inheritance, all of these things, right? But from being a law student, if you want to bring these issues up, you have a very limited way to talk about them, right? So, for example, if I talk about the hijab ban or if I talk about the right to wear hijab, right? I said, right, I have to talk about it in a way that's within a closed system, which in which only certain types of reasoning is okay, right? So, if I want to justify hijab, I have to use autonomy, choice, consent. Saying God commands me isn't enough. So only certain types of reasoning are allowed within this space. Um, that goes for even, inshallah, I'm hoping to take a bioethical law class next year. Same issue. Surrogacy, you can talk about it in terms of exploitation, in terms of statistics, in terms of data, in terms of consent, autonomy, liberty, but you can't, like, even if I wanted to talk about it from a religious perspective, that would have very limited influence or a limited relevance, because they've kind of set this boundary of like you know modes of reasoning within the legal field, or at least that's what I'm seeing and I'm starting to be exposed to, which makes it difficult because it's not like we discount, as Muslims, policies, right? Driving 50 miles an hour instead of 60, or setting the speed limit as 50 instead of 60, that's not like haram or halal. Maybe you could say like, oh, the data tells us at this speed you're more likely to kill someone, so then we could argue like, okay, then Muslims have a imperative to set the law that X or Z, right? But in general, like, these are in the realm of, like, so we don't discount. What I'm trying to say is we don't discount data, we don't discount statistics, right? We do take them into account when we're trying to come up with policies. But at the same time, though, it is very much limited, just our legal system. And I'm starting to struggle with how I'm going to bring in this, you know, this, I'm learning the Islamic sciences. How am I going to bring that into my career and into my work? So that's becoming a bit of something that I've been thinking about lately. I hope that made sense and I didn't ramble too much, but inshallah.
No, that was a really good point, especially like the limited nature in terms of phraseology used, especially I think you said the hijab situation. It reminded me that I have one of my teachers who's also academic within university. They were mentioning that, you know, simple thing within, I guess, the social sciences department, you can't just quote, Quranic, ayah, and, kind of unpack that and use that and intertwine it within philosophical discussions. And, it gets frowned upon. I think, like, he tried to, like, I think he did, like, he just put the basmala in front, like things like that. And it's like, it gets frowned upon when, they look at that. And like those kind of instances where it's almost like you're handicapped in terms of actually showcasing or representing Islam and your beliefs and unpacking those. And we know, obviously being Muslims, and we know our intellectual heritage, that there's a lot to say. Islam has a lot to say in these kind of discussions. But if you're already straight away forced to not bring it up, or leave it at the door, and kind of succumb to the language of, specifically the English context, or it has to be said in a certain way, you're going to miss a lot of the big picture. If anything, you're not going to, really unpack truth, right? Or
Hmm.
really get to those kind of, heart of those conversations. And yeah, that's unfortunate. And I don't see like how it's going to get any better, honestly. I think the one way, like, mashallah, especially with traversing tradition, we, if as Muslims, we have our own sort of spaces and circles. And even like, from my own sort of personal standpoint, like, especially with my, for example, Dr. Samir Mahmoud, my teacher as well. He has that experience in academia, and so like you have those kind of Muslim spaces where he's obviously talking about from an Islamic perspective, but he's also encountering, the kind of prevalent thoughts and ideas within academia. You can kind of combine the two and really have those kind of discussions. So I guess as Muslims, it's almost like we're left to build our own kind of communities and spaces to really unpack those conversations, because within, specifically in a university context, you're very, very limited, if anything, in my opinion. Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, in terms of, I also wanted to touch on language and linguistics. I think it's a really fascinating discussion, and something we can really engage with, and potentially might, I don't know, connect with the previous topics, or something that we've already talked about. But is I know that what got me really interested, I think, from memory, you did a minor as well in linguistics in your
Yes.
degree, as well as you wrote like a whole article. And I remember like coming across, I read a bit of it a long time back, and then I tried to find out, couldn't find it. And when I reached out, I asked you for it. And because that's a really fascinating, it's something that really sparked my curiosity, in the sense of, um, we see, I guess, around us, the intertwining of different languages coming together. So for example, in specifically, even because I'm Bengali, you can see the effects of, for example, because of globalization, and English is like the predominant language, it's almost like there's words in English that are embedded now into the Bangla, Bengali language. And it's almost like that kind of mix, right? That's happening, like things like, chair, like no one knows the Bengali word of the word chair. They just kind of use it now. It's almost like intertwined and exchanging of these kind of languages. We see that, and I'm witnessing it now. And I can only imagine that, many, many years ago, with the clash of, civilizations, or different societies coming together, there's that intertwining and mixing of languages. We know it's prevalent within, especially when Muslims conquered the world, and went to different societies and places. Arabic became, sort of part of, words of Arabic, became embedded into their own languages. So I guess that's why, my curiosity just came from that. And obviously, from the Islamic perspective, we know, Arabic is really important. And so, how that came about, and why, especially when we know as well, Adam alayhi salam was taught language. And so I guess the whole conversation is like, what I found interesting. And I was asking like Subur Ahmed about like similar question, where it's like, um, because within language, because we communicate it, right? Let's just say, like, I think the whole conversation of how did it even come up. Let's not put Islam to the side, but I guess if you were to kind of try to theorize it from just like your own kind of intellect, right? It's almost like, how can someone just come up with a language and communicate it and learn this whole kind of vast language in that in conveying it and and just kind of communicating and these words coming up and then different types of languages popping up. Like, how did it all happen? It's like, I think it's like a miracle in of itself. If you couple that with, human beings and how we go about doing things, etc. But anyway, sorry, I'm just going into a bit of a ramble, but that's essentially the reason as to why it's really interesting. Maybe the listeners will find that kind of conversation very interesting. But since I'm talking about kind of early languages, what are your thoughts about the earliest language in human civilization, or in general? And what are your thoughts? Like, what would it be? Like, is there such a thing? Can we even pinpoint such a thing called the earliest language within humanity and civilization in general?
Yeah, so what is the world's earliest language? I think I've read way too many BuzzFeed like articles trying to answer it, and the reality is it's a wrong question because I'll attack the earliest part first. It becomes a question of like the earliest human, whatever language the earliest human spoke is the earliest language. The reason being is that language changes over time, and there's no like point at which we say, oh, this language is now another language, right? Like continuity, like for example, English. We do have a, old English, middle English, modern English, but if you hear old English, it's not understandable by most people. It's not that mutually intelligible. Uh, so can we really say there's a continuity there? Also, the way that we categorize languages just laterally, so not just like back in time, but also today, right? The way that we categorize languages, for example, Hindi and Urdu are pretty mutually intelligible when you're speaking, which means speakers of those languages can understand each other pretty well. But for like historical, geopolitical reasons, they're categorized as separate languages. Chinese is considered one language when you look at like statistics and stuff, but you have Mandarin and Cantonese, which are very different. Speakers of Cantonese and Mandarin can't understand each other. So there's a problem with how we're classifying, so there's a problem with timeline, and then there's also a problem with what we're characterizing as a language. And I wrote an article about this on my Medium page, and I go into a little bit of the technicalities of like, are we looking at written language? Are we looking at oral language? If it's written language, you know, do like Egyptian hieroglyphics count as a language, or is that more of like pictures? Uh, so it's a question that's really hard to measure. And for me, I was like, you know what? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala taught Adam alayhi salam the names of things. That's a language. Whatever he spoke, that's the first language. And that's what I would say is my position on this.
Yeah, it reminds me as well. If I like when I was talking to Sheikh Saleh Basir, I think he's also at Dar al Qasim as well, and
Yeah.
he also like he brought up the point that when it comes to Arabic, because you talked about written and spoken, it was really interesting. What he mentioned was there's this modern, like, it's really interesting, like I guess the society and the way the world that we were in sort of shapes how we should view things. And so when we think of language, it's almost like we're thinking of speaking, like we're all automatically thinking of communication, right? And what he mentioned is like, I guess classically, there wasn't this almost there wasn't this obsession in terms of using, when it comes to Arabic language, that kind of communication aspect. It's more so I'm talking about, like, I guess traditional scholars that weren't from the Arabic background. It's more about excelling in the Arabic language from a written perspective and kind of
Mm.
articulating that, right? And so that kind of obsession to communicate and speak in Arabic it could be now like a more obviously, like we know through the Sierra and stuff, they spoke Arabic and communicating poetry. By in saying, I guess, that obsession now, it's almost like it's almost seen as only communicating and that's it, if that makes sense. And there's not that kind of written aspect to that. So I guess even the society that we're in shapes how we perceive language or how it should be utilized. But there's that kind of written aspect as well, which is almost sidelined within that conversation, which is really interesting as well. But
Yeah, in our undergraduate classes, it was actually interesting because from the first day, they told us like when we say language and we're studying, I took a languages of the world class, language in US history, like these different language in the mind. They were like, we're not looking at writing, we're not looking at orthography or writing systems because writing systems, like they were that was just their approach was we're not looking at writing systems because even the connection between writing system and languages can be tenuous. They change over time. Korean, for example, like King Sejong just sat down and said, okay, kanji is way too complicated, let me come up have the best people in my cabinet come up with like a simple writing system, and that was that. So there's like the link between writing and spoken language. It's writing is almost considered like its own separate field and language in and of itself. So that's interesting that you bring that up, because at least my experience in the field was you separate the two very much, and the focus was on spoken language, or ASL, like just you know not written basically.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Especially in, I think, your article, you mentioned that language isn't as clearly defined as one might think. Could you maybe elaborate on that statement from your article as well?
Yeah, I mentioned it earlier with the examples of like, you know, language we think of as like hard and fast categories, when in reality some of them are like considered separate, but they're, for example, Portuguese and Spanish. They're I mean, one Spanish speaker told me that like she could understand a Portuguese speaker maybe like 70% of what she was saying. So that's like a higher degree of mutual intelligibility, but they're considered completely separate languages. You also have issues with like pidgins or creoles, which is like when two languages make contact, like Singlish, right? Singaporean English. Should we consider that that's its own language? Do we consider it a dialect? Do we consider it an accent? So it becomes very difficult to create these hard boundaries of like, this is English, this is and this will always be English in the future. English is changing, language is constantly changing. So there's an entire field dedicated to understanding how languages are related to one another and how they branched off. Like there's a whole, there's theories like of a proto whatever language that split off and became two languages, right? Um, and it's like a family tree. They use language that kind of, or they use terms that when you're studying, it feels like you're studying a family tree. Like, oh, these are sister languages. This is the language parent. This is the language daughter. Um, so it's a fascinating field, but the main takeaway is categorizing languages is not as easy as you would think. Um, you know, uh, like you mentioned the example, even Urdu and Hindi, there's so many borrowed words. I remember asking my mom, like, oh, how do we say table in Urdu? And she's like, nobody says the Urdu word for table. We just say table, you know? So is there a point at which, oh, after we adopt this many English words, this is now considered English, right? Like, it's not a hard and fast science, or not science, hard and fast criteria to determine what language is which.
Yeah, and it's really interesting, especially when it comes to uh, language specifically. And I wanted to ask you this, and this question is a fascinating one when it comes to language and shaping the way we think. Would you say language shapes the way we think? Because there's a lot to unpack there. But when I thought about that question, I guess when it comes to planning, because you mentioned it in your article, but it just kind of reminded me. I think David Hume makes the argument that the empirical, so I guess the external world shapes the way we think, and that's because, like, for example, in our mind, in our imagination, we imagine in blue, green, red, etc. And so, henceforth, why our thoughts and our reality is shaped by the world around us, and that kind of argumentation. And so, I found that really interesting. Like, it kind of correlates. Obviously, I wouldn't agree with his take because it. I think it kind of. I think when it comes to the perspective of a higher reality and imagining something beyond what we see, there's obviously more. And so I don't know if the imagine, like, Allah can kind of perhaps, like, we know for Isra al Miraj, like Rasulullah was taken to the heavens and experiencing things you know in ways that we cannot. So I assume, like, potentially, Allah can gift thoughts and realities of the mind, or even like when it comes to spiritual experiences, that it's not like it's only going to be shaped by the world around us. Like, those thoughts aren't it's I can't, like, it wouldn't make sense from the Islamic perspective to make that case that David Hume is essentially like around us. All the thoughts are shaped. Obviously, there is, but not in the very absolute sense, right? But sorry, that was a bit of a tangent. But it kind of
No,
relates to
no.
this question in terms of you have languages, people are learning and studying and talking around you, but does that also shape the way we think?
It's a really good question, and it's a very like hot button topic in psycholinguistics. You'll often hear people say like, "Oh, people who speak multiple languages, like, oh, I feel like I'm a different person, or I have a different personality when I'm speaking a different language." But it is subject. It has been subject to a lot of debate. It actually started in, just to give some context, for people not familiar with this issue. In the 1930s, there was a researcher, Benjamin Lee Whorf, and he was studying the language of the Hopi people. They're a Native American tribe, I believe. And he studied their language, and he claimed that the language, the Hopi language, it didn't refer to time that many European languages did, like with a spatial kind of next to, in front of kind of way. And he made the assertion that, because of this, the Hopi people understood time differently. Not that they didn't understand the concept of time, but that they understood it differently. And uh, from this kind of arose this concept of like the Whorf Sapir Whorf, or Whorf Sapir. I think it's the Sapir Whorf hypothesis, right? Which refers to a broad umbrella of different theories, language relativist theories. So on one end, there's a really kind of strong hypothesis that language determines the way that you think. You have a more moderate kind of hypothesis, which is like language influences the way that you think. And then there's other variations as well, but those are kind of like the broad um, camps. And language determinism's been largely debunked because people are like, that's way too, it doesn't make sense. Like, you're restricted to, just thinking in the way that your language allows you to think in. But there has been a lot of research and papers, and this was basically my entire language in mind class, was reading a bunch of papers of researchers trying to see if the way that different things in language, uh, if the way that language encodes different things affects non-linguistic tasks and behaviors. For example, so in Mandarin, the for earlier and later, English speakers understand it on along a lateral line, right? When we think of earlier and later, we think of earlier on one side, later on the other side, usually left to right, because we also write left to right. Mandarin speakers, earlier is up and later is down. So there were a few researchers that tried to see, like, ask Mandarin and English speakers to, like, categorize things as early and later, but they primed them with like a vertical line or a horizontal line beforehand. And they found that when they were primed, like Mandarin speakers, when they were primed with like that vertical line beforehand, they were quicker in answering these questions. And English speakers were quicker when they were primed with like a horizontal line. So there's been studies like that. They've looked at studies in like the area of color, because languages encode color differently. For example, like we have one word for blue. We do have like, light blue, dark blue, but we would say, blue is blue. Russian speakers have two very different words for what we would both say is blue. So there's been studies looking into that, and other languages have, you know, fewer color categories. And so they looked at like, okay, if you have fewer words for color, does that affect the way that you can categorize colors? So there's been those kinds of studies that look at these, different areas, their numbers, gender, um, you know, uh, whatever kind of like semantic category. And it's still not, there's no consensus. I personally do believe like there is, I am convinced, I would say to a degree, that language does influence the way that you think, especially when when I started learning Arabic and started getting deeper into our tradition. I thought about like the emphasis on what, like learning Arabic, right? Why do we put such a big emphasis on ensuring that the Quran, we memorize it in Arabic, we encourage others to learn Arabic and to read it in Arabic. Like we don't consider like in English translation of the Quran, like the Quran, right? The Mus'haf, right? We only really have that level of reverence for the Arabic. So that really, just that idea alone makes me think there must be something special about the Arabic language, in it being the language that Allah Subhanahu wa Taala revealed the Quran in, as well as like people talk about the richness and just the different grammatical um, beauty of it. So it makes me think like there has to be some wisdom in it. Maybe it's beyond my brain, but there has to be some wisdom in like why Arabic is the language in which I have to shape my understanding of the Quran, right? Or my recitation of it and my living of it. So I am convinced by it, and I think a lot of people are they like to toy with the idea, like George Orwell with 1984. He had the whole concept of newspeak, like the state was trying to create this language because they didn't want people thinking certain revolutionary thoughts. Or I don't know if you've seen the sci-fi movie Arrival. It also hinges on this idea of like the main character, she learns the alien language, and as she learns it she starts to develop their ability and think about time and experience time the way they did. So I think people in general are very seduced by this idea. I wouldn't say like that extreme is like language shapes like it's some like the brain is like clay and language is shaping it like that. But I do think there is something to be said about like it does influence and it kind of shapes the way that you understand certain concepts.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. Even especially like you brought up the point about the emphasis of Arabic and why there is an
Mhm.
emphasis in really understanding that. It reminded me even specifically. We know Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam came from the
Oh,
Adnani sort of line of Arabs, and the Zaqahtanis, and eventually the Adnanis like really picked up the Arabic language and were like masters, and and in saying that, it's like there's a purpose and reason as to why Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam came from that side of things
Allah.
and not from like a different tribe in of itself, right? And we know that if you link it back to, I guess, how Arabic came about, and the Adnanis being the expert in Arabic, and in saying that it's almost, we know obviously like Quran is in Arabic. There's that you see like on twofold in that sense, where it's like there's an emphasis on Arabic on both fronts from the people that Rasulullah was with, coupled with Quran being revealed in Arabic. And so those, even like, I also know that when Islam was going around the world, and I guess even resolved like different civilizations were interested in Islam, and there's a whole idea of even doing translations of the Quran. That was like, I think apparently it was a controversy in that time. It's like, do you want to make a translation from Arabic into this? Like, aren't you already reducing aspects and the sort of essence of the Quran, because the Arabic language is very vast and encapsulates many meanings, and as soon as sort of put the translation, you're reducing it already. And yeah, and those kind of conversations were really or at one time, from my limited knowledge, were prevalent. And I guess the reason harks back to the importance of the Arabic language. And there's surely a wisdom, I guess, in this conversation we're talking about, in that point about shaping our thoughts. I think when it comes to the Arabic language, we know that iman, taqwa, like even these concepts, it's almost like very hard to just come up with an English
Mhm.
equivalent and sort of unpack these themes and ideas within those words and terminologies, right? And it would be really hard to unpack that from just like externally, from not from like the Arabic language. Like if we're using different languages, I'd sense that it's a lot more difficult to really unpack those Islamic concepts and ideas without kind of using the Arabic language. And sorry, this also reminds me, when it comes to language, like I can only speak because I know a bit of Bangla, like not fluently, but I can speak Bangla. And even in our sort of phraseology, um, like for example, like I don't know if is it from subcontinent, maybe you've heard of words like taratari, which means like quickly, um, you know, cholejai. Like there's almost like some words we use to describe like normal events going on, like come quickly. There's actually like a rhyming pattern, and I guess there's a reason as to why like the Bengal area was known for poetry and poets. It's because like there's a in some of the words we use, there's an embedded like rhyming pattern at times. That is
Yeah.
one example, the common one we use, and so that aspect, or so I guess from a language perspective, it's really fascinating that it's almost like when we speak English, we don't have that, like almost as if we're saying certain words, there's a rhyming embedded into that word that we're saying. It's just words are words, we just say it, right? But I guess when it comes to different languages, you'll see different patterns arise, where it's almost like me and you, like I'm sure you have that kind of confusion, like you speak your kind of mother tongue, and then it's really hard to translate to an English equivalent. So there's always that recurring theme, and yeah, I think that also plays maybe into the idea of language and shaping the way we think as well in that context.
Yeah, I believe what you're referring to is reduplication. So, I mean, it's like a repetition, but like we speak like a mix of Urdu and Hindi. I wouldn't say we speak like pure Hindi or pure Urdu. But yeah, like choti moti, like
Yeah, stuff like that. Yeah,
pati shati, like there, yeah, like it's like you have the word and then it's like a nonsense word that rhymes with it. Um, that and it's hard to explain to if I had to explain that to an English speaker, I don't think I could because there's a difference. Like there's just a difference you understand between like just saying choti versus choti moti. Like there's a quality that you're not going to get from a direct English translation. And some people will say, well, that's not really language influencing thought. How do we know that's not culture influencing, the way that we understand our language? And, yeah, I mean, it's hard to isolate as like the one influencing the other, but I do think there is something to be said about the fact that, we learn certain languages and is certain languages have qualities that you just cannot get in English, right? Like English, I don't think will ever have the poetic quality of Farsi. Um, it's just you can't do it. Um, or and then with Arabic you mentioned examples of words like taqwa or even deen, right? We translate deen as religion, and religion has a particular connotation and a particular understanding in the Western world, that which doesn't really exist when you say deen. um, so those are issues. And I definitely agree, like when it comes to translation it can be really tough because you can even take the time to explain it, but it's just not going to have the value or like the emphasis that uh, the words in those original languages have.
actually, that was a really good point that you brought up, and it reminded me, especially with the word "deen." It kind of ties into secular understanding where um, commonly gets translated as religion, and religion even in of itself, I guess this is more like potentially a post-structuralist thought, in the sense that even in our certain context, religion has a connotation which is like a personal belief that you keep to yourself. Like there's all
Hmm.
these kind of baggages on baggages when it comes to I guess the underpinnings of understandings of certain words, right, in our context. But we know that even within that word in of itself, there's a level of understanding when you have like religion, or it's only just a spiritual thing, and that's how people perceive that word or define that word. You just keep it to yourself, and that's almost like an assumption. But we know, obviously, through Islamic tradition, deen perspective, you know, it's an all-encompassing way of life. To the way you walk into the bathroom, to doing and eating, and looking and reflecting, pondering, and like it's an over encapsulating. It's a in it's almost like a world that we have to live by, to the very T. Every single action is shaped by Islamic principles, but that's almost like a whole world of itself, where it's almost like the word religion is not going to encapsulate that. Like people aren't going to get
No,
that.
it's
There's
not.
like so it's a very very reductionist. So it kind of ties into that kind of secular talk that we were having previously as well.
No, absolutely.
But yeah, there's also another question I wanted to ask, because I know you talked about it in your article, and I found it really interesting and a fascinating point. Um, if I recall, it was read the article a while back, but I remember it was, I think there was a experiment where one person, another person, were observing the same situation, but I guess the language that was being used to describe the event was differing, and as a result, it's almost like because of the kind of word positions, people observed different things of the same event. So I'll probably butchered that, but I got my notes here. Like the
Right.
researchers argued that constructions available in the respective languages influence what the speakers paid attention to. I might be completely misunderstanding what you wrote, but I don't know if you understood what I was saying, but can you maybe
No,
elaborate
I'm
on what I was saying?
I'm trying to remember which paper it's referring to. Um, I know there's one which is the Loftus and Palmer one, which was with the car crash video, but I don't remember if
I
this is
think
the
it was
same
the car.
paper.
Actually, I think so. Yeah, I think it was the car crash one.
Okay. Yeah, and since you studied psychology, I'm sure you're probably familiar with it because it kind of straddles the line between linguistics and psychology, where the a group of students were showed a video of a car crashing into another car, and then they were asked about it, and depending on the word that was used and the words available in the answer choices to the students, they had different answers, like how fast was the car going when it smashed into the other car versus hit the other car, collided with the other car. um, and smash is a much stronger word than hit. So students that were given that question were more likely to estimate the speed of the car as higher. um, I hope that's the study that you're referring to. So it's interesting because then the researchers came back a week later and they also gave another follow-up question, which was, oh, was there broken glass due to the crash? And students that had the last week had answered with higher estimates of speed, they were more likely to say, yes, there was glass at the scene of the crash. So it's interesting because the researchers kind of shaped the way that they remembered the video because of the words that they used, smashed versus, hit, right? And this becomes really, this is important because you see, once you start to like spot these issues, you see it everywhere, from the way like politicians speak to like, copywriting, and people make intentional word choices because they're trying to subtly orient you to a certain conclusion. And actually, it's very relevant in law as well, because when you're advocating for your client, you're not you're not, I mean, I want to be clear, you're not making up lies. But if there's an issue, you try to word the same issue in a way that kind of minimizes the harm on your client's side, and tries to maybe shift the burden a little bit onto the other side, right? So it's very interesting, and that was probably I remember in that class, or in one class, the language in mind class, the professor had examples up of like different speeches from politicians, and trying to show like, oh, which ones, like, can you tell what this politician is trying to do? um, so that's that was the context of that paper.
So even in that paper, would it be safe to say as well that speakers of different languages remember different things from the same event?
I think I know what you're talking about. I do think that's a different paper though, because this paper focused specifically on eyewitness memory. I do, I would have to look at the article, but I know that there has been, um, oh, I can give an example. I don't know if this is a paper that you're referring to, but for example, this is actually in Australia. There's a group of Indigenous Australians who speak a language, Yimithir, I believe. I can't pronounce it, but they speak a language in which space is encoded using nautical directions, right? Like north, south, east, west. They would say, oh, there's a fly near your west foot, or something like that. And I think there was a study that tried to see if, like, because their language was forced them to encode space in this way, if they were better than speakers of, let's say, English, at like being able to position themselves, right, in a space, like, and being able to tell like, oh, this is north, this is south, this is east, and this is west, because the language itself required them to do that, right? Whereas in English, like, I have no idea what north, which way north is at any given time, because I can say, oh, you're in front of X, you're behind Y, you're next to Z, right?
Yeah, and I also wanted to ask as well. It might be relating to previous point that you're making about language, but it just reminded me that because there is, how languages emerged and how they came about. I think that's a vast field and topic, but especially with your kind of biology background, it becomes interesting where it's almost like, because that kind of whole evolution theory of evolution kind of conversation pops up. So I was just wondering and curious, like, have you had to grapple with, I guess, how language emerged and intertwine it or combine it with, I guess, the theory of evolution, in the sense that, for example, the theory goes, we were animals and, evolved into humans. And so within that kind of animal phase as well, did we already speak a certain language, or was it only when we came into kind of the transition more into humans? Um, uh, did we essentially develop our language then, or is it something else? Like I don't know. I just found it really interesting. It just kind of sparked that curiosity. I don't know if you had to kind of grapple with that question as well.
Yeah, I wouldn't say I don't think I have because I took a because it was a minor, it was a limited number of classes. I think it was like 8 classes, and all of them focused on like human languages. I know that there have been, animal languages have been heavily researched, and I know that there's been some speculation about, Neanderthal language. Did they speak in the way that we speak, or some kind of proto language, human language, or something like that. But yeah, that's not something I've really looked into much.
Fair enough. Yeah, like I guess with languages, it's a really vast conversation, and really unpacking that really very yeah, it's very important discussion and interesting discussion, especially when we know how important the Arabic language. I think that's what like really brings it together for me personally, where it's almost like we know the importance of the Arabic language, and so I guess this conversation of language and how it emerged is also fascinating in of itself. Especially like if I recall, I think Islamically Arabic, I guess how it was spoken during the time of Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam was like, I think Yatrib, I think was the original person that was seemed to have come up with the language in of itself, and then people started to speak around him, and eventually, um, you know, uh, Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam came into
Oh,
a time where people were speaking that language and using that language, and I guess the poets and poetry was prevalent, and Arabic poetry is very profound, and so those kind of conversations within language is really fascinating, and how that all came about. But do you have any sort of last thoughts to share before I ask you, I guess, the final question that I wanted to ask in terms of, I don't know, language or linguistics or anything that you found interesting you wanted to share as well?
yeah. With Arabic, so much of it because the you know at the time the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they were primarily an oral people, and so we don't have too much record. I do remember reading a paper. I think it was by Ahmad Jalad, who wrote about a few, like, we do have some records and some like stone writings in some type of Arabic or some precursor to Arabic before Islam, or like rather before the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So that's something that you could look up. I remember briefly scanning through it. It was just, it's so limited, like what records we have. It was only, after Islam flourished, and we that like that's why so much of Arabic, that's our record. But there are like a couple things out there maybe, and where people could learn about and see, what was Arabic before, what was Arabic like before.
Yeah, definitely. And I think yeah, there's a lot of like history to that. I think like the Arab, I guess people within the kind of Arab society, then even Ad and Thamud would have been like, I guess, categorized within that kind of Arab. Um, when it comes to linguistics, maybe they were speaking a type of I guess earlier version of Arabic, and how that came about, and Ibrahim alayhi salam, and that kind of situation. And I think Sam as well. That's, I think, the lineage of, I guess, Arabs, or Arabic language came from that sort of lineage as well. So it's really fascinating, I guess, how it kind of intertwines, and especially when we know from our own tradition, it's almost like the prophets is the conversation about our earliest sort of prophets are in the picture in of itself, which makes it all very interesting as well. But I think as well, I wanted to ask you kind of a last question, because uh, really appreciate your time, coming on Boys in the Cave, and having this discussion. I really enjoyed it. We touched on very varying topics, and really touched on important discussions as well. And yeah, the sort of last question we do ask, well, I guess, is if you had to chill with three people in a cave, because the podcast is called Boys in the Cave. Who would it be? It could be anyone from the past or the present, and yeah, someone that's influenced or shaped you. ideally, like we try to stay away from. We just assume that the Sahaba and Rasulullah Sallallahu are in the cave because it's like we want a variety of answers. But you know, who do you want to who do you want to hang out
Mhm.
with? Three people in a cave.
Hang out with three people in a cave. Ya Allah. That's a very let's see. Who's good at like survival? Oh man. Oh man. I
Even
mean,
with
I
your
could go
family.
the funny route or I could go the serious route.
Up to you.
If
Whatever
it was
comes first.
the funny route would be I would want to, with women that I'm continuously inspired by, like Rabia al-Adawiya and Sayyida Nafisa, um, and one more. I guess my husband, but we can put him in a different corner so I can hang out with the women.
Can you give a bit of background the people that you mentioned as well? It's a quick summary
Yeah,
why it's
so
good.
Sayyida Nafisa, we actually visited her the where she's buried in the masjid in Egypt in Cairo. She was one of the teachers of Imam Shafi'i, and she was a very known for her piety, and her and just her modesty and her devotion. And then Rabia al-Adawiya was also like I don't want to start a debate, but we can just say she was like a really pious woman and a wali and um, again just very known for her devotion. So
Yeah, like it's really mashallah, I think within the Islamic tradition as well, there's been pious, righteous scholars, females as well, and they don't seem to maybe get highlighted as much, which is
mhm.
like a shame. But yeah, thank you for sharing those as well. But yeah, like, did you have any sort of final thoughts before we wrap up the episode in general, in terms of I guess future projects or anything about the pipeline for you? I know you mentioned you're doing law and stuff, but anything else you wanted to share, or anything else that you're doing, or future plans?
Yeah, inshallah. I'm hoping to continue researching. I'm hoping to publish a few articles on surrogacy so I can, anyone who was a little confused by my ramblings, hopefully I will streamline them into an article form. And Jazakallah khairan for having me on. I followed Boys in the Cave for quite some time and I've listened to a few episodes, so it's an honor to be on. And I pray that it was of benefit to you, to the listeners. And I ask Allah for forgiveness for anything that I've said that was incorrect. And please forgive me for any of my shortcomings, inshallah.
Yeah, thank you for coming on, accepting our invite. I really enjoyed the conversation. Like a lot of stuff that you touched on, we haven't really touched on in the past. So it was refreshing to really go into different topics and unpack that, and as well as coupled with varying topics and having those sort of discussions as well. So I'll probably wrap it up there, inshallah. So for our listeners, thank you for giving us your attention. If you wanted to ask us any questions or reach out to us, follow us and message us on our social medias. So we're on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook as well. Feel free to reach us there, and give us a 5-star rating on iTunes, as that greatly helps us, and write a comment as well, inshallah. And you can, I'll put the social media, Sister Hera's social medias in our show notes. You can check out her stuff as well, inshallah. And looking forward to sort of seeing what you come up with in the future. So yeah, from our special guests, Sister Hera and myself, we wish you all the best. This is Tanzim signing you off. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.